You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 243. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Welcome back to the podcast, and thank you so much for joining me here this week. We are going to dive into a topic. We're going to talk about grief and how to support yourself and others through periods of grief, whether they stem from personal or professional setbacks. The reason that we are talking about grief today is that, as you know, there are pockets of life where grief creeps in. The experience can feel isolating and, depending on the loss and how deeply you feel it, potentially debilitating. We often think of grief as occurring after a major loss, like the loss of a loved one. But there are other losses that can trigger feelings of grief, like losing your job, like a loss of expectations, whether it's personal expectations about where you'd hoped to be at a certain point in your life, loss of professional expectations, titles that you had hoped to hold, accomplishments you'd hoped to have had by now. Grief can be caused by loss of friendships, so friendships that have naturally run their course, or maybe you move cities or you move jobs and you leave behind relationships and you really miss having those relationships in your life. And grief might also come from parenting, whether it's loss of expectations in terms of who you are as a parent, or maybe even loss of expectations on behalf of your children. Things that you had expected and hoped that they would have that you now see are likely not going to happen. So these are just a few ways that grief can show up in your life. And whatever the source, what I am hoping for you today is that this podcast episode will be a resource to support you through any periods of grief that you might experience. Now, at the time of this episode being made live, which is the beginning of 2026, the beginning of the year, is, in my view, a time where it's really helpful to have some resources to support you through feelings of grief. This can be a really tough time of year for a lot of people. First of all, we are on the heels of the holidays, and the holidays, while they are potentially full of joy and cheer and togetherness and love and all of the things that we associate with Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, whatever it is that you celebrate, and the arrival of the new calendar year, it can also be a time where there's increased difficulty, right? Maybe there were unmet expectations about how your holidays were going to go. Maybe you were in contact with people in your life, family members, or people who you see at these types of events where the relationships are strained. Maybe you had some triggering conversations and you're still reeling over something that somebody said. It may be that you return to work after the holidays, you're scrolling through your social media feed, and it seems like everybody around you has had the most amazing holiday season. They've been promoted at work, and you look at your life by comparison and think, well, wait a minute, I didn't have that amazing holiday trip. Wait a minute, I feel a little bit stuck relative to where I was last year. And so you might have those additional feelings of uneasiness. And because it's a new year, you feel this pressure that you should be excited, and yet you're not. So there are a number of factors that can contribute to feelings of grief. And I'm really glad that we have this opportunity early in the year to talk about it and potentially offer you some support that you might be needing right now. So what I'm hoping to do today, with the benefit of my amazing guest, who I'm about to introduce you to in just a minute, I am hoping to normalize the conversation around grief and provide you with helpful tools that you can use to empower yourself and manage any difficult feelings that you have. Now, to better understand grief better, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome our very special guest today, Jayne Rossworn. Now, if you already know Jayne, if perhaps you have been a client of hers through her counseling practice, or if you have seen Jayne speak before, you already know how amazing she is. But if Jayne is new to you, then let me share a few words so that you know what you can expect. Now, Jayne is an invaluable resource to lawyers who would like support with mental health and or career development. She is a former practicing lawyer turned registered clinical counselor with a master's in counseling psychology. She works with the Vancouver-based counseling service, The Lawyer Mindset. And The Lawyer Mindset may be familiar to you because its founder, Beena Stock, has been a guest on the podcast before. Beena, if she is new to you, is a brilliant lawyer turned counselor like Jayne, and she is an amazing resource for lawyers who are seeking support for mental health, career development, also a speaker. And so you are in very good hands today with Jayne. And I am delighted that you have the opportunity to hear from her today to talk about this very nuanced and delicate topic. Now, Jayne, I think, is the perfect person to talk about this topic. She is brilliant and compassionate and offers a very textured approach to this difficult topic. She has, in addition to her background as a lawyer, a background advising law students in career services. And she also has a background as a competitive elite athlete. She has also coached other athletes. So what I love about Jayne is that she's got this really interesting background and she brings that high performance mindset to her practice as a counselor for lawyers. She really understands what you're going through and she has a really great way of explaining the tools and strategies to help you. Currently, Jayne counsels lawyers and other high performers, supporting them with anxiety, overwhelm, and stress management. She helps lawyers rebuild their confidence and resiliency after setbacks, and she helps lawyers with career guidance and planning. As I mentioned, she also speaks regularly about wellness and mental performance topics relevant to lawyers, athletes, and other high performers. You are going to learn so much from Jayne and our conversation today, including what grief can look like, different stages that you might expect in grief, and also strategies to support yourself and others through the various stages of grief. This may be a message that you or someone close to you needs to hear right now. And if that's the case, I encourage you to share this episode with anybody who you think would benefit from hearing it. Thank you again for joining us here this week. It is an absolute pleasure to have you. I know you're going to love this conversation with Jayne. So without further ado, I'm going to turn you to our recording. Hi, Jayne. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here with us today. I feel like you are the perfect person to dive into today's topic. And so as we get started, I would love for you to please introduce yourself and let our listeners know a little bit more about you, the work that you do with lawyers, and maybe a bit also about how you got to where you are.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Paula, so much for having me on this show. It's so nice to see you and to have this conversation with you today. Yeah, so I'm a registered clinical counselor. I work for a counseling practice that's based in Vancouver called The Lawyer Mindset. And we work one-on-one with lawyers and other, legal professionals and, other high performers generally to support them through work and life challenges. So I'm actually a former lawyer myself. I worked mostly as a corporate solicitor. I worked in private practice. I worked in-house. I freelanced for a bit. And then as I was kind of transitioning out of the practice of law, I ended up working as a director of career services at both Thompson Rivers University Faculty of Law and then at Allard Law up at UBC. And so in that role, I worked with hundreds of law students, kind of helping them with their career journeys, and a lot of mental wellness things came up in that as well. And I realized, I really love this counseling piece. And so I decided to go back and get a master's in counseling psychology to be able to work more broadly with individuals, with lawyers, with people in the legal profession to help them as they navigate life difficulties.
Thank you so much, Jayne. And it's lovely to see you as well. I have the benefit of seeing you on Zoom. Our listeners sadly don't have that as well, but But thank you so much for joining. And I really love that you have the experience in clinical counseling. So you've had these conversations with lawyers who themselves are practicing, and you also bring your own experience as a lawyer who has practiced. So you know what it is that lawyers go through day to day. And as you mentioned, you've worked with hundreds of students to help them with that career aspect. So I feel like you're so well positioned to help us talk about grief and loss and all that goes with it in a very specialized way. So thank you so much for being here today. To start us off, I think one of the misconceptions that a lot of us have is that grief is something that is very unique, right? It's the loss of a loved one, and that the bar has to be that high. And I would love for you to tell us a bit more about grief and how it might show up in a lawyer's life, whether it's in their legal practice or in their personal life.
Yeah, this is such a big question. And, first of all, before I dive in, I just want to acknowledge, for anybody listening, if you have experienced a loss and you're feeling the pain of it, yeah, really acknowledge that pain, right? And I'm so glad that you're here with us today for this. And I want to remind people too that if anything we talk about like brings up something and you need crisis support, right, there are options available to you. If you're a lawyer or in the legal profession, Lawyers Assistance Program has a 24/7 crisis line you can call. There's a BC crisis line for the general public, right? So just reach out to those supports that you need. Yeah. So Paula, with grief and loss, the way it shows up is in so many different ways. And I think you pointed out how we often think of grief coming about from death, the death of a family member, but it can come about in a lot of different ways. And when I first started thinking about this topic a while ago, I have a background in elite sport and coaching. And, through that work, I've noticed that athletes, when they were injured, when they experienced setbacks and competition, these sort of things, they went through a real grieving process for things that they had lost through that identity, their physical abilities, those sort of things. And as I took that work into the work I do with lawyers now, and I see all these, of course, there's a ton of overlap, athletes are high performers, lawyers are high performers. And I see grief and loss show up in so many different ways. And at the same time, a lot of high performers they have a ton of strengths, right? Their ability to stay composed under pressure, to put aside emotions, to do hard things, to really analyze and execute and, put high expectations on themselves to perform, all really valuable strengths. And there can be a cost to those too, where they're not always processing or validating for themselves certain losses that they might actually be experiencing. So when we talk about those particular losses, right? Yeah. So it could be personal losses, right? And like we talked about the death of a loved one, definitely is the most kind of obvious one here. Pet loss is also a big one. Those are loved ones as well, right? Could be life-altering injuries, terminal illnesses, like things that can come up in your personal life. And then also other things we don't think about as loss as much, like breakups, divorce, falling out with a close friend, aging, right? Thinking about yourself aging or your parents aging. And then changing family roles. So even things that are really positive in a lot of ways, like becoming a parent, right? There's a changing role there and you lose some sense of identity of your pre-parenting role. Sometimes we move to a different city and we lose a community. So those are kind of personal losses that can really bleed into our work life as well. And then we've kind of got these professional losses. And the way that the legal profession is set up, we're in an adversarial system that's high stress. We're, often high performers. Yeah, we experience a lot of loss. It's actually quite common in the legal profession. And of course, the most obvious is job loss, right? So layoffs, that sort of thing, or maybe not getting a promotion you were hoping for, or maybe getting that promotion. So say you go from being an associate to being a partner, and there's that changing role and that shift in identity that can bring a sense of loss as well. I've been talking to a few lawyers lately who have been experiencing a real, a shift in their practice areas with the introduction of enhanced care now and personal injury law really being very different than it used to be. Huge layoffs at ICBC, it's really produced a lot of loss for those lawyers. And then lawyers in private practice who can't, don't have access to practicing personal injury law anymore. We often feel the grief of what we call an assumptive loss, right? When we experience a big career setback, we have sort of these assumptions about how the trajectory of our career is going to go and what that future is going to look like, right? Sometimes we feel losses experienced by our clients, right? And then sometimes we have this sort of anticipatory loss that can make decisions really difficult, right? Because every time you make a tough decision, that means you're choosing one thing and not being able to choose another thing, right? So you're missing out on that. And that can bring up a sense of loss. I feel like I'm going on a lot because there's so many. So I feel like I could really list these forever. And also, it's also important to note that so many of these losses can accumulate too, especially if we don't resolve them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think what I'm hearing, Jayne, and what I'm really appreciating about the way that you're setting this up is that grief and loss, as we've both mentioned, isn't limited to loss of a family member or somebody who's really close to you. And what I think is really important for our listeners is that they may see themselves. I'm really glad that you went through a number of different examples, because sometimes we may be going through a loss and we don't even realize the extent of that loss and how it is impacting us. And the example that you gave about shifting identity, right? When you become a parent, right? It's something that we anticipate, we think it's going to be so great, and it is on many levels. And yet it also means letting go of an identity of the person that we were beforehand. The example of a workplace transition, right? A job loss, of course, being one where you would expect, I mean, depending on the circumstances, but in a lot of cases that there would be a disappointment, right? An unmet expectations, a feeling of, this didn't work out, and there can be a lot there. So that would seem like something that would make a lot of sense. But also, as you mentioned, you may be promoted to partnership in your firm, and now you're taking on a new identity. And it may mean that the relationships you have with your peers are shifting. You're no longer on sort of a level playing field, if it were, with them. And now you're maybe taking on more of a role where you're delegating and you have more authority, but that may also mean that you're setting new boundaries, etc. And so I think this approach, this looking at your professional, your personal transitions, and how as things are shifting, there are losses along the way, even when the overall shift is good, can really be validating for people who are thinking to themselves, I should be happy, right? This is all that I ever wanted. And yet it comes with a cost. And sometimes that cost is losing identity or things that we once had. So I'm so glad you set it up like that, because I know I can see myself in some of the descriptions that you just gave. And I'm guessing for those who have joined us and who are listening, it might be really validating for them too, to hear, okay, so that thing that I went through, now I understand, I can put a name to it. So I'm really grateful you set it up like that. When we talk about grief, and if we use grief as maybe the term that captures what we're ultimately getting at today, and I appreciate there's nuance that we won't be able to get into within the hour, but if you were to describe grief, how would you describe it?
And before I get into the definition, I also want to acknowledge that, all these examples that we've been talking about, there is a loss there, and a loss will result in grief. I mean, that is basically what grief is, right? It's a reaction to loss. But I also want to acknowledge that, I'm like, the loss of a close family member, it's not the same as, the loss of identity you feel from going from an associate to a partner. The pain is going to be different. But I think, like you said, it's important to at least acknowledge that there is a loss wrapped up in that, because it can be very validating. Because I think a lot of what I've seen is sometimes people, they think, oh, I should be so happy with this. And they still kind of feel a little bit sad or feel a sense of emptiness. And then that can bring up some self-doubt. Oh, have I made the right decision about this? And yes, they probably have, but they're just feeling a sense of loss around that. So I think that's, really highlights why that's important. But yeah, so to go back to what is grief. So yeah, grief is a universal human experience, and it's actually a necessary reaction to any perceived loss of something or someone that's important to us. It's a really complex experience. So it's not just an emotion, and it's a whole experience that involves many parts of our being, right? Like our physical, our social, our spiritual, intellectual, and emotional beings. So, and yeah, like you said, when we talk about loss, it's not just about death. It's any kind of deprivation or ending, a loss that comes about from transition or change, even positive change, like you said. And then I also want to distinguish here between grief and grieving, right? So grief is the reaction to the loss, and then grieving is a process. And it's actually, a process of learning how to live without the person or the thing that was lost.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jayne. And just circling back one moment to the identity, something you said, and I wanted to just circle back to it, is I think you mentioned you worked with high performing athletes. We are speaking about lawyers in these environments where the identity of the person is so wrapped up with the thing, right? The athlete, the lawyer. I think in those cases, sometimes that identity shift can be even more profound because we see ourselves so tightly wrapped up with the role that we are playing. So I just wanted to mention that because I know I have felt like that when I shifted from lawyer to coach. There was a loss of being that person. And so for some lawyers who are listening, where you're losing that identity, that one role and moving into another, it can be a real shift. Thank you. And so if we're looking at grief and we're looking at it as that process, the grieving process, what are the stages that you might expect to encounter?
Yeah, good question. So, you've probably heard of the 5 stages of grief. I feel like, it's kind of, for the last several years, has been something common to talk about. So that was introduced by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross back in 1969. And what she was describing was a situation of people coming to terms with their own death. And she noticed them go through these experiences of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And we kind of turned those into these 5 stages that sort of were misinterpreted as, oh, these stages you're supposed to hit, right? In order to kind of like move through grief or recover from it. But there's actually no research backing that the grieving process has to go through these stages. And Kubler-Ross herself always said that these are descriptive, not prescriptive. So I think those stages can be really helpful for putting language to experience, right? I think many lawyers who are experiencing grief and loss can identify with a lot of those experiences. So it can be a valuable tool for self-understanding, right? But it's not always helpful for lawyers to interpret these stages linearly, even though that's often what their mind will do. Think about like how, in law school, we learn about all the tests in case law, right? Okay, there's this, there's a 3-part test you have to follow and you get to a conclusion that way. Or every time you write a memo, it's like you've got these steps. Okay, set up the facts, the issue, the law, analysis, conclusion, right? It's always this linear approach. And so lawyers' minds are very good at that. But grieving's not a legal process, right? And sort of that linear stepped analysis approach, it doesn't really fit here. So it's not an issue to be solved. We can't come to a conclusion, but it's an experience that needs to be lived and a process of learning and adapting. And I think, the thing about thinking that we need to move through stages, for lawyers, it can also have the effect of sort of triggering some of those perfectionistic tendencies that lawyers sometimes have. And the risk here being that lawyers might think there's something wrong with them if they don't feel all these, oh, I never felt angry about this loss. Oh, does that mean I haven't grieved it? Which it's not the case at all.
Ooh, thank you so much for clarifying, Jayne. That's really helpful. And I think models like that are really helpful for being able to understand and identify with a category or categories and to feel validated. But I love what you're saying about it being not necessarily the definitive process, that it doesn't have to happen in that sequence. All of the boxes don't need to be ticked. I think I'm thinking the way that you're describing it, right? There's the checklist, there's the legal test, there's the checklist. Have you done it correctly? And what I'm hearing is that there is no one approach, that there is no way of really describing the process for anybody to grieve correctly, that we're all different. And what seems important here is just recognizing that we'll all have our own process and it's okay to do it differently than the 5 stages.
Exactly. I think what you hear from most people, if there is any kind of commonality with the way grief works for people, is you often hear, oh, it comes in waves. Right. So, which is very nonlinear, really. It's just like, sometimes you get hit with it. You're overwhelmed by grief and you're sad, you're crying, you feel physical tension and you may feel nauseous, like all these symptoms. And then other times, you can do other things in life, right? You can go to work, you can take care of your children, all the things that you need to do. And that's actually so there's something called a dual process model of bereavement. And it sort of talks about oscillating between those two. And that's actually like a very healthy way to grieve.
I'm so glad you said that. It reminds me of times where I've been okay. And then somebody will ask me something like, oh, Paula, how are you doing? And the way they look at me triggers something. And it's like, wow, I didn't even know that was there. So it's reassuring to know that this is normal, that it will come in waves and sometimes at the most odd time. So thank you for that, Jayne. If we are experiencing grief, right, we've had some sort of a loss and we can feel it. What recommendations do you have in terms of how to process the grief?
Yeah. So, a metaphor that's commonly used in the grief and loss world is it's sort of the idea of a wound, like a physical wound, right? So a loss, creates this, say you cut your leg or something. Some losses are going to have a really deep wound. Other ones, might be a little more superficial, but it creates this wound. And the idea is that, okay, so at first, there's a lot of pain in that wound, but eventually it will become integrated into your body and it will turn into a scar. So the grief won't be gone forever. That loss is still with you, but it doesn't have to be painful forever. So grief is kind of like the pain that tells us we need to tend to the wound. And there are some, ways that we can do that by processing the grief. And that starts by accepting the reality of the loss. And that's kind of what we're talking about here today. When we talk about the death of a family member, there's a lot of shock and can be denial and all that stuff that comes around it. But, in some ways, society recognizes that as a loss a lot more. And the types of losses that we're talking about today, we might not always recognize as a loss. I remember even years ago when, right before my husband and I at the time divorced, I came to this realization that our relationship was over. And I remember my counselor saying to me, I'm sorry for your loss. And I was like, oh, yeah, it is a loss. Like I hadn't even acknowledged that to myself. And there was something about, that acknowledgement at that point that, helped me kind of validate that experience for myself and move through it. So in this sort of accepting the reality of the loss is, naming that for yourself, right? Validating that. And as hard as it sounds, embracing despair, right? So if you feel despair, that's actually a pretty good sign that your brain has stopped trying to find the person or thing that's been lost. And it's accepting the reality of the loss. Right. Sometimes like a helpful tool here can be to write a goodbye letter, right? So if we're talking about identity changes, maybe you write a goodbye letter to your previous identity as an associate or, as a non-parent or something. And just write a goodbye letter to what you've lost. That's kind of a good thing to acknowledge to ourselves. And then, the really part that can be really challenging for lawyers is to, process the emotions, process the pain. Lawyers tend to be doers, right? We don't always want to feel things. And like I said, this can be such a strength because we need to get things done all the time. Law is very demanding, very task-oriented. And we're trained to think, to analyze, to compartmentalize. We're not really trained to feel very much. So when we talk about processing the pain, we talk about, okay, just noticing and naming and putting those emotions into language, right? Talking to a counselor can help with this, or even just talking to your friends, family, journaling, kind of, and then recognizing that your body is also experiencing grief, right? There's a physical component. And so also getting in touch with, okay, what tension is my body feeling right now? And noticing rather than trying to run from it. Because again, we need to listen to those emotions because they can give us clues about what you need, right? Sometimes you feel a real sense of loneliness. If you can name that, then oh, maybe it's time to reach out to a friend. And then, the other thing that you already brought up, Paul, a big part of processing grief is the adjustments that we need to make, processing the implications of the loss. And there's going to be a pretty big internal adjustment a lot of the time in terms of your identity, right? So kind of helping yourself answer the question, well, who am I now? And then there's external adjustments too, right? There might be new duties or new skills you need to take on, right? So how does this loss change the things I need to do, right? So if, you can't, there's no work in personal injury law anymore. How does this change the way that you work and the tasks that you do now? What type of law are you going to move into? And then sometimes there's sort of more like kind of spiritual or existential kind of adjustments around sort of your beliefs, your values, your assumptions about the world, right? If you, say your work in an area is dried up, your assumption that, oh, if I just work hard, I'll be successful, that might have been a little bit shattered, right? So how does this loss change your worldview? And then finally, we want to find a way to keep a place in your heart for the person or the thing that you lost. Remember that scar is part of you, right? And honoring that. And being willing to get busy living again, right? Reintegrating into your life, building the life that you want for yourself based on your values. And thinking about, okay, if this loss left a gap in my life, how can I meet that need for myself now?
That is so helpful, Jayne. Thank you. And thank you for sharing your own experience with loss. I think that I really felt that when you described it. And I think it really does feel validating when you have somebody acknowledge that there has been a loss. It feels really like almost like a weight is lifted off your shoulders when someone else sees that. So thank you so much for sharing that. I also really loved what you said about despair being a good sign, because I can tell you in moments of despair, it's probably not the first thing that would come to mind, but
no, that's not how we think of it usually.
To be able to reach for that in the moment is truly helpful. And going back to what you said about saying goodbye to the person, to the identity, to the thing, I always love to, when I can, and I can't always do this, reflect on what elements of that I'm grateful for. So even if it's something that maybe wasn't in itself all that great, maybe it was a relationship that wasn't great, or maybe a part of myself that I'm letting go, that I'm letting it go for a reason. I also think there's a real value in finding the gratitude for what that experience brought. And so as maybe it's a form of closure, I don't know clinically what significance that would have, but I know I find it helpful when I do something like that. So
definitely. Yeah. And there is good research out there showing that if we can kind of find meaning in the loss, that helps us, to move through grief. It helps us to move forward. And there's a really good book by David Kessler called Finding Meaning. And he calls it the 6th stage of grief.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And so he worked with Kubler-Ross. And so that, they had, a relationship where they worked together. And then he kind of, added the 6th stage later on. And so, I think exactly what you're saying. If we can find, the gratitude in what we learned from it, how, as painful as the loss might have been, as much as we, we don't want it to happen, there is still meaning that we can find on it.
Yeah, it seems to bring about a feeling of peace in some cases. So that was really helpful. And then I just wanted to circle back to the do versus the feel. And I am so one of those people who likes to compartmentalize the feelings and simply do. And so I think just acknowledging that, recognizing it, and that we are allowed and we can and would potentially benefit from going through what you've described, the processing of the feeling.
Yeah.
And that brings us to our next question, which is in the context of the legal profession, right? We've got this culture for lawyers. There's this idea of pace often, right? It's a quick pace environment. There is a culture often of perfectionism, right? The standards are certainly high and in some cases perfectionistic. And then there's this idea of stoicism, which to me sort of captures this idea of we will do, regardless of what's happening, we will do. And so how does the culture affect how lawyers experience grief?
Yeah, I would agree with all that. Absolutely. There's a lot of pressure to perform. And despite emotional strain, despite kind of, yeah, what's going on in your personal life or what kind of feelings there's stuff, deadlines have to be met. Like things have to be done, right? Things don't stop or slow down because of an internal experience that you're having, right? So definitely, yeah, there is the stoicism, right? The legal profession often rewards kind of this emotional detachment and ability to maintain our composure, which, yeah, can have the effect of suppressing sort of normal expressions of grief. And then, a lot of legal employers, I mean, not just legal employers, but employers in general, don't always have like formal policies or the culture that kind of supports grieving. I mean, I think, the Employment Standards Act only allows 3 days bereavement leave or something like that. So it's not really in the culture. And then just sort of, we've got sort of these stigmas around what it means to be a strong advocate for others. And that doesn't always include room for our own vulnerabilities too. And then, I mean, the legal profession still, I think this is changing in a good direction, but there's still a lot of lingering stigmas around seeking mental health support. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that students entering the profession had to disclose to the Law Society, any mental health issues they have. And then, kind of on the, topic of this conversation, generally, a lot of grief is kind of disenfranchised, right? It means that certain losses are not always seen as losses, right? They're not always socially sanctioned as like worthy of grief, right? And so, yeah, it's not always seen by ourselves and it's not always seen by others in our firm. And yeah, like you said, it's fast paced, it's busy. And so you don't always have time to grieve. Like that's actually a thing. So processing the grief can look really different for the realities of law. And so what I usually suggest to lawyers is to actually just schedule some time, put it in your calendar as time to process a loss, right? Time to grieve. Because, yeah, it's busy, right? And, there's sort of like we talked about, okay, sort of doing and feeling, right? And when we talk about grief research, we sort of see that there's often a split that's been named between those that are intuitive grievers, sort of that display outward emotion and seek social support. And then there's instrumental grievers that focus on the practical tasks. They use, work as a coping mechanism. They just get stuff done. So these are different grieving styles. And, like we talked about before, it's healthy to move between them both. But I think, generally speaking, the legal profession kind of rewards that instrumental grieving style a little bit more because the legal profession tends to be very action oriented. There's value based on billable hours, all that kind of thing. But yeah, of course, both are important for processing. We kind of need that yin and yang.
I'm so glad to hear that. I've not heard that distinction. And again, I can certainly think of situations of doing both, right? And the idea that it is actually a valid form of grieving to pick up and move on, just as it's valid to take the time. And I love the idea of scheduling time, right? If we're really busy and we know that we will not have time to do that work, to reflect, to feel, to do whatever it is we need to do, to put it in the calendar. And it sounds so formulaic, or why would I ever do that? But sometimes that's what you need to do, right? You're that busy. And so I love those suggestions. Thank you so much. On the topic of being busy and the pressures of being a lawyer, burnout is, of course, something that lawyers will often experience. And so when you think about grief and perhaps unprocessed grief, how can that contribute to lawyer burnout?
So, I mean, yeah, burnout is, very simply stated, it's emotional, mental, physical exhaustion that's brought on by prolonged or repeated chronic stress. So the stressors, are coming at us externally all the time, especially, yeah, in the legal profession, very demanding schedules, high stakes environment. And then when we hold in unprocessed grief, we create stress internally as well that can really prolong suffering. So it takes a lot of energy to suppress difficult emotions. And so I think, we're learning a lot more. People are becoming a lot more aware of how unprocessed trauma can affect us in very physical ways and can lead to illness, can lead to like all sorts of autoimmune disorders, like this idea that the body keeps the score, kind of thing. And the same thing with unprocessed grief, right? Is that, yeah, when we hold things in up, eventually our body is just like, oh no, I don't want to take this anymore. And then the other thing is, too, if you don't kind of deal with difficult emotions in a sort of safe and protected environment, they can pop up at times when you don't really want them to. So we need to give them the space that they need at appropriate times. And then the other thing is too, sometimes, yeah, if we emotionally numb or we kind of get this, like if we're in a chronic state of stress or grief and loss, sometimes we develop a bit of cynicism or we don't feel as empathetic towards others. And this can cut off our social connections too, which is just really important for preventing burnout and just enhancing your sense of well-being overall.
Yeah, that is so helpful, Jayne, because it reminds me of just the importance of keeping that tabs really on your own self and your health. And I think we all have those little warning signs that we can tell that we're, something's off, whether it's we're getting sick or we're tired or our bodies start to feel a certain way. And, maybe you're withdrawing from your friends, you're not feeling all that positive. So I love what you're suggesting here, what you're highlighting, because I think we all need to really take responsibility for noticing what's going on with ourselves, and maybe others will help us with that. But to have that internal barometer so that when we need to make changes, whether it's changing something about what we're doing day to day, seeking support from our friends, from a counselor like you, from somebody who can help us, I think keeping that self-monitoring is really important, and appreciating that our emotional lives matter, right? That they matter and they will let us know. Our emotions will let us know if we're not giving them enough attention. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, they provide good information.
100%. Really good information. Really good. So if you are, for example, a lawyer and you are grieving and you notice that it's starting to affect your work performance, what might you do in a situation like that?
Yeah, and definitely, a lot of the grief experience can, create sort of this load on your cognitive abilities that can really impact work. It can create this inability to focus on things. You might have sort of a reduced loss of purpose, and this can kind of make you look like you don't have as much drive for work. You might notice that you're more forgetful and you're disorganized, right? Or you're just, yeah, sometimes you just have to take more time off of work. So it's important to build like a toolkit for yourself, right? Because like we talked about, the grief, it'll come in waves, right? So you're going to need to know those moments when, yeah, the grief is really intense. What can you do about it? And sometimes, yeah, at work, that's going to be suppressing it. That's okay sometimes, right? Yeah, if you need to get through a meeting or something, yeah, you need to use your compartmentalizing skills in that moment and then go back to your scheduled grieving time to deal with those emotions, right? So there's so many tools in the toolkit that you can use for yourself. So, I mean, I encourage everyone to think about what works for them. In particular, some people like intense exercise to get that energy out, right? They want to go for a run. Other people like, more like yoga or something more relaxing or something creative, right? Those are kind of things you can do for yourself. But while you're at work, you don't always have access to those things. So it's helpful to have just little grounding exercises, just taking a few deep breaths, getting connected. A really helpful grounding exercise that you can do in a meeting or whatever, like no one even has to know you're doing it, is called progressive muscle relaxation. And so it's kind of where you tense up and then relax sort of your major muscle groups. So then you sort of feel that contrast between tense and relaxed, and it reminds you of what, it feels like to be relaxed, right? Even just in that moment, even just for that bit. So that can be really helpful. And then of course, seeking social support. And in the legal profession, there's a lot of law specific support available as well. So definitely seeking that. And then kind of over the longer term with work. Yeah. So if you're noticing some disorganized thinking, here's a great opportunity to lean on your organizational tools, lean on your support staff who can really help you. And, keep in mind, like I mentioned before, grieving is a form of learning, right? Which is quite mentally taxing. So it might not be a good time to like take on a lot of new things or make really big decisions. You want to kind of, where you can, try to manage the demands on yourself. And sometimes that might mean having to say no to others, which is really hard in the legal profession. I get that. Anyone who, that's kind of a whole other topic. And I presented a CLE BC webinar earlier this year. And so you can find that on their website. They have the recording of it if you want more tactics around saying no. But, and then the other part about sort of the longer term picture is, the research shows that these acute grief symptoms come up a lot around anniversaries, holidays, certain times of the year. Like I noticed for myself, I mentioned my divorce being a significant loss. And every year around the time when the separation happened, I have this week of where I feel really nauseous. It's not even a conscious thing, but it's like it manifests physically. And that's quite common for people to just have this sort of physical manifestation of it, even for things that, like intellectually you've moved on from. So just sometimes, you need to anticipate that's coming. And, if you can sort of, work your schedule around that, maybe like, reduce the demands on yourself during certain times of the year, do some extra self-care where you can during those times.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Jayne. It sounds almost like the grief itself has an impact on what I describe as executive functioning skills, right? You talked about forgetfulness and organization and planning and those sort of things. So it's almost like getting additional support in terms of overall how you're managing your practice. I also really resonate with what you said about it being something that you may experience and as an anniversary. There are events in my life where there are certain times of year where I anticipate that I'm going to reflect on something that happened in the past, and some of those things no longer really affect me, but some of them do, and I want them to. They're anniversaries of maybe the death of somebody that I want to think about at that time. And so knowing that is going to come and to be prepared for it and to give yourself some extra support, right? If you can anticipate that might be a period where you're not 100% or you want to take some time away so that you can process or do whatever it is that you need to do in that time, that you're giving yourself that, right? That you're planning for that in advance, knowing and expecting that's likely to be something that you can expect to experience. So that's really helpful. In terms of the circumstance where maybe you yourself are not grieving, but somebody in your organization or somebody close to you is grieving, what are your thoughts in terms of how you might support them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know what? It's tough for people because they don't know what to say. Yeah, and so a lot of people they'll avoid approaching the grieving person because they're worried about saying the wrong thing or they're worried about making it worse. And that's, that makes sense because there is actually nothing that anyone can say that will take the pain away. At the same time, that person, they want your support there, right? They want your presence. So ignoring them or avoiding them is not going to be helpful. So sometimes it might mean just saying literally, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say, but I care. Yeah, I lost a family member when I was 18. And I remember one of my best friends, she came over to my house and she just sat next. I don't remember her saying anything, but she just sat with me. And that had such a profound impact, right? That just that presence. So listen, be present. Don't push them to talk about anything if they're not ready. Don't attempt to resolve the feelings or fix or problem solve. Just listen. And then sometimes, we like as human beings, we feel other people's pain and we want to make it go away because it's uncomfortable for us. So we want to offer advice or try to fix it somehow. So try to avoid that temptation. And I think too, for workplaces, it's important too to recognize that there's a lot of differences in how people grieve. And, this can be just individuals. There's a lot of cultural differences. Some cultures are, more collectivist cultures will want to grieve with people. And then, in our sort of dominant patriarchal culture in North America, we tend to see grieving as more of an individual kind of process. There can be some gender differences in the way that we've been socialized. So, we sort of talked about the difference between intuitive and instrumental grieving. And women generally have been socialized to grieve in a more intuitive way. And whereas men, tend to be more instrumental grievers. But then, of course, we add the layer of the legal profession culture, and that can change things too. And women also have really been socialized to care for others too. So even if they're grieving themselves, they might show their grief by putting all that into caring for other people too. So I think, workplaces, can be so supportive of their people by recognizing and making room, being flexible for these different ways of grieving, as well as sort of, providing access to supports, to counseling supports, to mental health supports, sort of normalizing that experience, sort of proactively bringing in wellness initiatives and that sort of thing.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jayne. Jayne, we have one last question. It's been such a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate everything you've shared. And the question is, what is one thing that you wish every lawyer knew about grief?
Oh, man. There's so many things to know about grief.
I know, we could go on. We really could. We're just scratching the surface today.
Yeah, it's a huge conversation. But if I were to sort of whittle it down to one thing, I would say listen to the wisdom of grief. What is the grief telling you that you need? Remember, grief serves a purpose. Remember, it's that pain tells you that the wound needs care. So how do you need to care for this wound? How do you need to care for the pain right now? And then also, what is the grief telling you about what matters to you? Like we talked about, right? Finding meaning through the grief can be a really helpful way of moving forward, because life's most challenging moments can really deepen our empathy, can build our resiliency, our authenticity, connection with others. So meaning, probably won't make itself apparent right away when things are really acute, and that's okay. But continue to listen to the grief, and the meaning will come to you.
There's such beautiful words. Thank you. Jayne, for anybody who is listening who would like to reach out to you, to learn more about what you do, maybe to seek support for themselves or for somebody close to them, where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can go to thelawyermindset.com, and you can book a session directly on there. You can email me. Like I said, this is a huge topic, and I'm happy just to even continue the conversation if anyone has any questions or anything like that. You can find me on LinkedIn.
Amazing. And we will link to the website that you mentioned, the Lawyer Mindset website. We'll link to your LinkedIn profile. And Jayne, you mentioned a number of resources too during today's conversation. And so all of those links will be provided with the show notes as well. So anybody who's wanting to do some digging, you mentioned that book, I think is it David Keller?
Kessler, yes.
Kessler, close.
Yeah.
So we'll track that down and put all the links there. So anybody who's interested can find out more. So just a big thank you, Jayne. It's been such a pleasure having you here today. And a big thank you to everyone who joined us for this conversation. I think it's just been really eye-opening for me. I think it's really validating for all of us. And I just love how you've shared so many insights and ideas in terms of how we can think about grief and how we can move forward with it, processing it and kind of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Paula. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Wonderful. To be continued. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.